Ukraine is a flashpoint of tension between Russia and the West. Since the Euromaidan revolution of 2014, fighting with Russian-backed separatists in the east of the country has killed over 13,000 people. The Crimean Peninsula has been occupied and unilaterally annexed. And with Russian troops building up at the Ukrainian border, we can ask, how did we get here? And what does Ukraine mean to Russia? Ukraine is very important to Russia. They trace their common history back nearly 1,000 years to the Kingdom of Kiev and Rus. Its capital, Kiev, still goes by the nickname of Mother of Russian Cities. And for many Russians, including the Russian President Vladimir Putin, Ukraine is part of what he calls historic Russia. And Ukrainians and Russians are one and the same people. Roughly 30% of Ukrainians, mostly in the east of the country, speak Russian as a first language, and 15% of the population considers themselves to be ethnically Russian. And if we consider the borders of both the Russian Empire and the Soviet Union, in the past 300 years, Ukraine and Russia were part of the same country. And throughout that time, it was of strategic importance. Alongside Belarus, it served as a buffer for invasion, like during the Napoleonic Wars and the two World Wars. The port of Sevastopol in Crimea has been Russia's main warm sea water port. And after being part of the same country for so long, Ukraine was an important industrial base for weaponry. But that was until the Soviet Union broke apart in 1991. Bankrupted by its military operation in Afghanistan, the Chernobyl nuclear disaster, and an inefficient economy, it fell apart after attempts at reform in the 1990s, with nationalist movements across the Union declaring independence. This was the fall of historic Russia.
The red flag came down over the Kremlin tonight as President Gorbachev resigned and brought to an end 7 decades of communist rule in the Soviet Union.
15 independent states which share only a disastrous economy and an uncertain future.
The Soviet Union lost its puppet states of the Warsaw Pact, and with the 15 Soviet republics gaining their independence, Russia lost Ukraine. In the space of 2 years, the map of Eastern Europe went from looking like this to this. In the aftermath, Russia and the other former Soviet republics signed divorce bills to normalize relations and facilitate trade. And in the case of Ukraine, this meant handing over 4,000 nuclear weapons in exchange for guarantees to its borders and sovereignty. The fall of the Soviet Union would also lead to new relations between Russia and the West, but these relations deteriorated from what Russia saw as Western advancement in its sphere of influence. When we look at changes to the map since the end of the Cold War, NATO went from looking like this to this, reducing the strategic buffer that Russia had from more than 2,000 kilometers to less than 1,000. For Russia, this was the breaking of what they say was a promise by the West to leave Russia its sphere of influence.
Прежде всего, конечно, Соединенных Штатов перешагнула свои национальные границы и, по сути, во всех сферах. Получается, что НАТО выдвигает свои передовые силы к нашим государственным границам. И что стало с теми заверениями, которые давались западными партнерами после распуска Варшавского договора?
It's a promise the US and NATO deny ever existed, but despite it having never been formalized, and Russia now exaggerating how it was formulated, it is clear that on some level there was the expectation that this would be the case. And that is where Ukraine enters the discussion. After the fall of the Soviet Union, it attempted to keep a balance between Russia and the West, avoiding integration with either. While many of the former states joined regional organizations led by Russia, Ukraine mostly stayed away. But the country was deeply corrupt and controlled by oligarchs. And following an election widely reported as rigged by Western observers in 2004, a large protest movement called the Orange Revolution took to the streets. In part due to Western support for the protesters, the election was rerun, and the reformist opposition led by Viktor Yushchenko won. This marked the beginning of a rapprochement between Ukraine and the West. The country was invited to become part of NATO in 2008, and it joined the EU's Eastern Partnership in 2009. But in 2010, the reformists who were damaged by political infighting between the president and the prime minister lost the election to Viktor Yanukovych. It's at that point that Ukraine had to decide either between closer ties with the EU or Russia. This led the two blocs to compete for influence in the country. Ukraine, which had signed an association agreement with the EU, broke it off to pursue an agreement with Russia. This triggered the Euromaidan protests. Pro-EU protesters asked for the deal with the European Union to be put back on track. After the government's violent crackdown, the protests turned into a revolution. And the protesters, who initially had the backing from EU leaders, went on to overthrow Yanukovych's government.
Few would have predicted the speed of events. Parliament voting President Viktor Yanukovych out of office.
It split the country and triggered backlash, mostly in the Russian east. These two revolutions angered Russia, who viewed them in the context of an expanding US sphere of influence in Eastern Europe. In response to Euromaidan, Russian troops invaded Crimea, securing the strategic port of Sevastopol.
Russia says it needs to defend the Crimean Peninsula from a potential attack by NATO. But that's not the only reason it has brought the big guns here. A year and a half after the annexation, the Kremlin started operations in Syria.
It hastily organized a referendum to justify annexing the peninsula, where 96% of people voted to join Russia. But with a large portion of Crimeans considering themselves to be Russian, the result would have likely been the same if it had been a legal one. Russia also backed separatists in the east of the country to destabilize Ukraine and prevent it from getting closer to the west. Ukraine's disorganized army relied on a series of militia groups, some with far-right leanings, to defend its border, and it led to a 7-year conflict, with civilians paying a heavy price by indiscriminate bombing. And while in 2015, both Russia and Ukraine settled on a peace agreement called Minsk II, which sought to find a political settlement and reunite Ukraine with the separatist provinces, it has mostly stalled, and eastern Ukraine has turned into a frozen conflict. In response, the European Union and the United States have imposed sanctions that have isolated and weakened the Russian economy. Those sanctions and the status of Ukraine continue to poison relations between Russia and the West. But in March 2021, Russia started deploying unprecedented amount of troops near the Ukrainian border. And while it wasn't the first time that Russia organized military exercises in the region, this time something had changed. So why after 7 years was the situation so different? The answer is Ukraine. Since 2014, its democracy has been consolidated, moving up in international rankings. The country has also grown more assertive towards Russia. In a series of controversial language laws since 2016, it has removed the Russian language from media, business, and education. Crimea, which is cut off from the mainland, faces severe water shortages. Ukraine's army has modernized with American anti-tank missiles and Turkish drones. And as Russia seeks to integrate those living in separatist regions, giving passports to those living there, Ukraine increasingly sees the Minsk II agreement as a potential Russian Trojan horse in its politics. And its improved military has sparked Russian fears that Ukraine could retake the separatist regions by force. In November 2021, Russia started moving even more troops to the border, prompting concerns of an invasion. And while both European and American leaders talked of raising the cost of intervening in Ukraine, they refused to intervene militarily. But Russia has made a series of demands going beyond Ukraine, asking for security guarantees that would effectively push NATO's border back and re-establish its buffer, turning back the clock to 1999. Western leaders view this as Russia attempting to re-establish its sphere of influence in Eastern Europe and in the former Soviet Union, like with the Russian interventions in Kazakhstan and Belarus. But with Russian troops at the border and the failure of negotiations, what comes next for a Ukraine that increasingly looks to the West remains uncertain.